For as technologically innovative the Intamin motorbike and sidecar coaster is, it has one major issue. The iconic straddle seating adds a unique twist to the roller coaster at the expense of capacity. To combat this, the geniuses over at Universal Creative and Intamin came up with a variety of ways of increasing throughput, including numerous block zones, several high-speed switch tracks, a constantly moving load and unload station, and more. And this is exactly what we're trying to reproduce today in Planet Coaster 2. Last episode, we already took care of the station and the moving loading platforms, so that means today's episode will be entirely dedicated to the layout design process. So buckle up as we cortisol spike and overcomplicate everything to create a capacity monster family thrill coaster that reaches our target of 2,000 riders per hour, along with a few other goals. These are the objectives that we will be going for in this video. So as a quick refresher, these are the plans that I came up with at the beginning of the last episode. If you recall, this is the area that I focused on last time. So today we're going to build the rest of the layout. I'm going to roughly follow this in a park and see how it turns out. Here's the plan brought to life, and immediately there are some blaring issues. First, I completely need to redesign the swing launch spike section. The way I see it, there is no way that I can keep a block section that is this long whilst maintaining the 2,000 rider per hour throughput goal. And it's even visible here. The coaster is consistently setting up on each block section, immediately preceding the swing launch. And building off of that, as a whole, the block sections for this revision are way too long and uneven in general. Another issue I noticed is that the utilities are too spread out. Just based on what I've seen, it's much more realistic to have your launches and brake blocks condensed. And this is what I assume to be in order to minimize the footprint of your power grid. So, the key takeaways from this draft are to have more even block sections and to be more mindful when planning elements. Additionally, for future revisions, I will be building in the actual park. This will ensure I occupy the correct plot of land that this coaster has been allotted. This first draft was always going to be more of a proof of concept rather than an actual attempt at completing the coaster. So, with these points in mind, let's make some changes. So, from the old plan emerges something new. This is completely different. But this whole mess over here has changed a little bit. So first you can see the spike no longer is a swing launch. And this is how it is on Hagrid's. Now, you enter, and then you exit, and then the next train can enter. And that simplifies the block zones a lot. And then the ending is basically just a bunch of turns and stuff to end back here. But yeah, let's build it. Now for some actual building in the park. I guess the first thing on the screen you'll see is that I've set the banking offset to 2. I think in a later revision I set it to 3 as I'm building these parts. I made that decision because of the train. If you look at the motorbike and sidecar coaster train, it positions the rider's center of mass quite high off of the track. So in order to minimize those uncomfortable lateral forces, I think that calls for a bit of a higher banking offset, especially since this is a family coaster. And additionally, when you smooth it over, it'll condense all the nodes and reduce the banking offset further, so I think exaggerating it gave the effect I wanted. Anyways, another thing you'll notice is that I'm building this coaster old-fashioned, which is the 4-meter method. No mods or anything like that. That was a huge debate for me, whether I wanted to actually learn like force vector design, no limits, and then try and port that over to Planet Coaster 2, which people do, and people are doing amazing jobs at it, but I'm not a coaster builder. Like ideally, I would have someone who knows how to do force vector design. They'd build a coaster for me, and then I just detail that. As of right now, I don't feel like learning that stuff, but things could change. I've seen some amazing creators recently, like Time Slowing Down. So I'll post a link to their channel in the description. But that creator is seriously talented at making coasters in this game, and I'm not a coaster creator, I'm not gonna lie. As you can tell by the fact that we are so far into the series and there's only one coaster in this park. Moving along, this section here is supposed to be a show scene, and you'll see on the ground directly below it, there's like this circular shape I drew with the terrain paint, the gray stone terrain paint that's on the ground. And this is supposed to roughly match that circle because in the very near future, maybe even in this episode, who knows, there's going to be a circular building where that outline suggests one will be, and the coaster is going to go into the circular building. That should be pretty cool. It's going to be part, weenie for the park, and it's also going to be very functional and I guess a dark ride element of the coaster. So anyway, despite coaster building not being one of my favorite parts of the game, it's still, I've been doing this for, I don't know, the Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 days. I've been doing this for so long. Does anyone remember Theme Park Studio? Because I remember supporting that game like through a Kickstarter, and then I never heard anything about it, never received my copy of the game. I feel like I just got scammed. I don't know why I thought of that, but anyway, back to what I was saying. I've been doing this for a while, so I do have some small things that I like to roughly keep consistent when I build coasters. The first thing is that to keep good pacing, I generally aim for about 22 miles per hour or 36 kilometers per hour over the crests of elements. If you think of a roller coaster as being comprised of peaks and valleys, over the top of the peaks, I aim for this speed of 22 miles per hour. And then depending on how strong you want the forces, you shape it differently. If you want strong ejector, you'll shape it tighter. You want floater, you'll shape it more circular, right? So with that in mind, obviously, this is supposed to be a family coaster. I guess it probably would be considered family thrill. I guess that's the particular reason why I set the requirement for this coaster as being between 0 and 3 Gs. 3 Gs of positive force is pretty strong, but it's not like gray out strong, right? Unless you sustain it for a long time. But this coaster doesn't sustain it, so it's pretty tame. Like you'll feel pressed into your seat, but you won't gray out. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have our upper limit of 0 Gs. 0 Gs is okay, but I don't want negative Gs. I don't want people launched out of your seat. If you look at the real coaster, the restraints are a bit stronger. Like I don't know the exact class. I think they can support a little ejector, but then if you look at the in-game trains, they cannot support any type of ejector. I'll pull it up. Look at this.
Oh my God, bro.
Does that look like it can protect you from an airtime? No. It's just gripping your thighs. You will get launched. So to keep consistent with the train, because ultimately the train shape does affect how you shape your elements. Our trains have weak restraints, and they also sit high off of the track. If you look at the heart line of the riders, they're high off the track. So we're doing high banking offset for the heart lining, and then we're doing relatively weak G-forces to remain in compliance with the restraints. So it was at this point when I realized I didn't like the coaster. After analyzing it for a bit, I realized it didn't have that Intamin feel. So to gain that, I referred to a pretty interesting documentary on how Intamin designs their roller coasters on the Coaster Studios channel, which I will link the video in the description. It's pretty insightful. But essentially, Intamin Amusement Rides likes to design their coasters in a way that has distinct parts. And while this coaster, it followed the layout pretty well, it took up the space, but it didn't really have distinct parts. So we had to head back to the drawing board. So here we have revision number 2. The primary change between this version and the previous one was that the launch number 2 was in parallel with the spike, and now the spike is at an angle, and I like this idea. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the footprint of the ride now, because so much of the ride is over here. Meanwhile, this space here is pretty empty. It feels like a waste of space over here to not have much of the coaster track here. So, before even placing any new track down, I scrapped it and started over. And this brings us to revision 3, the final one. And this would be a version of the coaster that I build section by section, beginning at launch 2 into its first block section. I built that in game. Here I added launch 3 in the purple, and similar to the last revision, the spike is almost perpendicular with launch 2 in here in yellow. I then realized that I could have more of the track on the left side if I instead had the spike facing the other way. So now with this design seeming the most promising out of all of the previous versions, I started building this one in game. So on your screen currently is a nearly identical version of the plans that I just showed you built in game. And this is an aerial view of that design, just simply running one cycle. And the purpose of this video was for me to take my phone, open up the stopwatch, and time each section, marking when the coaster leaves certain block sections. For example, when a coaster fully passes over a block break utility piece of track, I simply hit add lap on the stopwatch. I'll keep note of that, and doing that across each block section yields us these results here. Behold the spreadsheet. At the beginning, I did tell you that we were going to overcomplicate this, right? So here we are with the physical block sections table. The first column has the number of block section that we're talking about. The second column refers to the name of that section, and the third column is the duration that that section is occupied in seconds. And if you look at the middle column, these names match up perfectly with the ones in the blueprint design. Now from these block sections, I noticed that I was going to have a bit of a problem if I kept them the way that they were. Primarily, I knew that I never wanted to have a coaster enter boost 1 block while a coaster was still occupying the launch 1 block. This is because even though it's possible to stop there and then launch and continue the layout, I did not want the trains to be dispatched that frequently. In another such place, launch 5 has a block break at the end of it, and buffer 2 is immediately after, and the total time that the train occupies each of these block sections is about 5 seconds each. But I know that I would never have a coaster in launch 5 and a coaster in buffer 2 at the same time. So I thought of the idea to create the effective block section, which is a way for me to combine these smaller block sections into larger ones so that when we determine the train spacing, no train will occupy these larger sections at the same time. You can see if I go back to the previous version, I just combined launch 5 and buffer 2 and launch 1 with boost 1, making the longer red and the longer magenta sections. And that is reflective in this second table titled effective block sections. So as you can see, there's no longer 14 block zones. Now we're just going to track 12. Now, when looking at the effective block sections, what stands out the most to you? Launch 1 is simply the combined times of both the previous boost 1 and the launch 1 block sections into an elapsed 26.4 seconds. So when analyzing it for spacing, the maximum single block section occupation duration. Wow, that's a phrase. So to me, the one that stands out the most is this launch 2 block. That is just way too long, a whole 9 seconds longer than the rest. And to have good, quick cycles on your coaster, we try to equalize all of these. So I went back to the drawing board in an attempt to divide launch 2 and launch 3 more evenly. And here is the newer design. If I switch back and forth between them, the cyan section becomes much shorter and the light purple section becomes much longer. So I built this in the game and made one more change, extending the helix around the spike. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the final layout of the coaster. Launch 2 is much more even with launch 3. Launch 4 is simply the spike. Launch 5 is after the spike into the pivot table. The pivot table is its own block. And then launch 6 leads us to the main break, the rise track, and our stational facilities. And that's it. So now with this newer version of the track done, we had to record our timings one last time. So now our goal is to figure out our theoretical capacity. So here is that same table filled out with the new measurements for the new layout. And launches 2 and 3 are much more even now. The next thing is to introduce you to delay 1, delay 2, and the reset time. So for a lot of them, it's empty except for a few key zones, and these are the special pieces. If you recall, buffer 1 includes a holding break, the same with launch 4. However, the pivot table and the rise track all have different settings. The delay 1 refers to how long it's going to wait before it does its action, and delay 2 is how long it waits before it launches. And the final column is the reset time. If I were to put this example on the screen now of the rise track, with these settings, the coaster would enter the rise track, wait 5 seconds before rising, wait 1 second, and then launch the coaster out. and then it requires an entire 4 seconds for the rise track to go back down and reset so that another train can enter. And I got this number just by timing it. It was found to be the same exact 4 seconds for the pivot table as well. And while it's not explicitly a setting, it does technically count for the block section being occupied, as that's the time it needs in order to accept a new train. And if you know how spreadsheets work, I set this final column to just equal the sum of the 4 columns to the left of it. Each one of these is the sum of all of those. And at the bottom, I have the sum here. And this is the sum of this entire column. That's the total ride cycle time for the train. After that, I then took the maximum value in here by just choosing max in the range of this column. And that is our 26.4. That's the minimum amount of time that trains can be spaced out with our current arrangement of block sections. Now, are you guys ready for some dimensional analysis?
Are you ready, kids?
All we need to do is take 3600, because that's how many seconds are in 1 hour, divide that by our minimum ride interval, and that gives us how many intervals we'll get in 1 hour. That's also the number of how many dispatches we'll have. And with 136 dispatches, that's 136 trains. So each train has 14 riders. So we multiply this number by 14 to get our theoretical 1904 riders per hour. Hagrid's has a capacity of 1700 riders per hour. So in that sense, we have beat Hagrid. That should be good enough, but I did set out to reach the goal of 2,000 riders per hour, and we're pretty damn close, so might as well see if there's any fine tuning we can do to cross that 2,000 threshold. So from here, what's limiting this is our minimum ride interval, and this 26.4, well, that's launch 1, but if you recall, that is the composite time of the boost 1 and launch 1. So it's technically 2 sections just combined as 1. And that's giving us our largest block section in terms of time. It specifically stood out to me how our longest block section also just happened to be one of our synthetic effective block sections that we made up by combining 2 previous existing block zones. And I started thinking, why would I even combine them in the first place then? Because surely if I left them as the 9.3 and the 17.1 sections, that would have reduced our minimum ride interval. So I needed to come up with a system, a way to mathematically justify condensing these block zones together, because then only after identifying why and how these larger sections form will we be able to reduce them. So to do this, of course, that means I needed another chart. Keep the idea of effective block sections in the back of your mind, because now we're going back to physical block sections. And here is the graph of every single block section piece of track on the coaster. Between this version and the previous one, I added a few more block zones as well as altered a few of the launch speeds. And for that reason, we had to retime the coaster, which is why some of the measurements in the duration occupied column you're seeing are a bit different than how they were in the previous chart. Added all these times together was roughly 160.5 seconds, which is about on par as what you'd expect, considering if we look at the coaster testing results, it's 151 seconds or something, 150 seconds, and that is leaving out the roughly 9 to 10 seconds that it takes the coaster to go from the unload station to the load station. Since that looked pretty good, I decided to add the delays in for special sections of track, and that yields us again this total duration column, giving us a total of 190.5 seconds of ride time now. With these physical block sections, the raw data tells us that the largest section is 21.7 seconds, and that's the pivot track section. If we take our total elapsed time and divide that by the minimum ride interval, I'm using a ceiling function here, so I'm rounding up, and that gives us a total of 9 trains. So this means that we would need a minimum of 9 trains spaced out at 21.7 second intervals to fill out the entire 190.5 second track cycle. And finally, this means that using the same calculations as earlier, we would get 165 cycles per hour, which means we would be yielded a total of 2,310 riders per hour. That seemed okay. Job done, right? QED.
Right? Wrong!
So with this information, I loaded up the game, set it to 9 trains, and set the minimum ride interval rounding up to 22 seconds. And when I ran it in game, it did not follow this at all. And that makes sense, as how did we gain 400 riders per hour without any substantial or significant changes to the track? In the game, it kept stacking and it seemed like I could dispatch the trains a lot more frequently than at 22 seconds. So I would just lower it by 1 second and then simulate each time. And I kept doing this all the way until I got to 12 seconds. 12-second intervals in game that seemed to have the best results. Running it at an even faster 11-second cycle also solved the problem of dispatching the train just as soon as one entered the final brake run, but it also brought about the issue of the coaster setting up mid-layout. So it seemed like the 12 seconds was actually the threshold, where it was not so fast that the coaster set up mid-layout, but it was also the lowest amount of delay that we could use before that issue happened. However, I did notice that one train would always stack on the brake run. It almost felt like there was no space for that 9th train. Ultimately, I ended up removing the 9th train and running it with 8 trains, which is still plenty. With 8 trains and 12 seconds set between them, I decided to figure out the exact amount of time between dispatches in-game, regardless of settings. So I went to a few of the longer block zones, and I took a stopwatch and started it when a coaster went by, and as soon as the next train came to that exact same spot, I would end it, and these are the results. With an average of a little over 28 seconds as our real dispatch interval, that was a bit jarring, especially if you compare it to our theorized interval.
That's the wrong number!
That's not the same as the 21.7 we calculated. And actually, if we were to do the same capacity calculations with this number as our dispatch cycle time, we'd get 127 cycles per hour for a total of 1,778 riders per hour, which is not even close to our goal of 2,000. So keep that number 28.16 in mind, as due to a variety of factors including the block zones, holding brakes, the layout and track length, the coaster has naturally found itself at a minimum of 28.16 second dispatches. Now let's bring it back to the in-game dispatch interval. Remember, things were good at 12 seconds, but they started stacking at 11. When the setting was at 11 seconds, the coaster would stack at launch 4, which means a train would be waiting in the middle of buffer 3, which would in turn cause a train to sit at the end of launch 3. So I decided to start there. So I you not, guys. I tried to optimize this coaster for over a week, and this section of the video ended up being over 20 minutes of pure math, so this is an attempt at summarizing my finding. First, of all the mathematical methods I used to try and deduce effective block zones, the one I chose was this formula here. And for lack of a better description, this is a cumulative sum style segmentation rule. And what this does is it allows us to take this total duration column and treat it as a 1D signal comprised of dominant peaks and feeders. This algorithm involves a conditional where it compares one block with the amount that has accumulated since the last peak. And if that block is greater than the amount of time that has accumulated since the last peak, then that next block becomes a peak too. And the non-peak blocks become feeders to the new peak, and you continue the process. I did that algorithm with all of the blocks here, as well as use my own intuition and simply looking at the track, and the splits that I deduced are color coded here. So these are the natural blocks that I've found using this algorithm and visually interpreting the track. Now if we take each color coded section and add them up, we get this column here, which I've called the natural beat. And this is the final evolution of the effective block zone idea that I had at the beginning. Due to the anatomy of the track and our block zone layout, train cycling on this coaster naturally resolved to the peaks and feeders. Another way to put this is if we removed all of the feeder blocks and simply had the natural beat blocks, the coaster would function the exact same. The physical blocks simplify into the natural beat, and if we look at the natural beat column, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That means at any given point on the track, coaster is in 8 zones, and that means that there's space for 8 trains, which is why when we tried to add the 9th train, there was physically no space for it, so it just sat on the main brake. Now when you observe these values, they look pretty relative to each other, except for the first zone, which is a bit lower. On first glance, it seems to be an inconsistency. However, that's quickly resolved when you realize that buffer 1 immediately succeeds the station, and the station block has the built-in 12-second delay that we set in game. So that means the station block and buffer 1 will form an effective block, and adding those two blocks gives us a natural beat of 29.6 for buffer 1, and that's right on par with the rest of these. It's also the largest of the rest of these, and that makes sense. At 12 seconds, the ride was not stacking at all. The buffer 1 block, the one that sets the whole pace for the ride, is the largest one. We're dispatching at about 1 second longer than the longest block here, and that means no trains will stack in the middle of the layout. And then if you remember when we reduced it to 11 seconds, this would have become 28.6, and it would have been a lot closer to these where there could have been some overlap. Remember, these decimals are not quite exact because I did use a stopwatch, so there's a bit of human error there. Like, these numbers here are essentially the same. So now that we've deduced that the natural beat exists, we found the natural beat in each section, the next step is to figure out how we can reduce the natural beat. Lowering these means we can dispatch trains faster. But just how much faster would we actually need to dispatch? Well, if we do the exact same calculation as before, just in reverse, if we input a goal of 2,000 riders per hour, it'll tell us that we need 142 cycles per hour, or about 25.2 second dispatches. All of these numbers in the natural beat column need to be less than or equal to 25.2, and that's where we run into problems. So let's go through this zone by zone. Zone number 1 is greater than our 25.2 seconds. However, we can change zone number 1 to any value in the range of 17.6 and 29.6, so we can just skip that one. The next zone of interest would be zone number 3, consisting of blocks 5 and 6. But if we also take a look at zone number 4, which consists of blocks 7 and 8, we can note that they're occupied for roughly the same amount of time. However, when the ride simulates, we get stacking here, but not here, which leads me to believe that this zone is fine, but this zone is not, despite being occupied for very similar times. But how can we figure out why that is? Let's go back to our 1D signal analogy. It was good for discerning between peaks and feeders, but it was not 100% accurate, so we're going to have to use our heads a little bit here. So the 1D signal works when values are not consecutive like this. If we 100% followed our formula, it would have said that the 14.4 block and the 7 block are both feeders for the 20.8. And that's just simply not how a roller coaster works. Relative to 14.3, 14.4 does not look like a peak, but relative to 2.8 or to 7, it does. And treating it as a proper 1D signal ignores this. A zone being a peak means that zone occupies a train long enough so that it won't stack on the next block. Therefore, its most important trait is its duration. If we know one block is a peak, then any longer blocks must also be peaks. And using that same logic, if we know one block is a feeder, every shorter block must also be a feeder. In our cases, our defining blocks are the 7-second and the 12.7-second blocks. When reducing the dispatch interval, we notice stacking at the 7-second block, which means that it must be a feeder, because it wasn't long enough, right? So it's stacked. And that means that any block less than or equal to 7 seconds in duration is also a feeder. And our formula told us that the shortest peak was 12.7 seconds, so any block greater than or equal to 12.7 seconds is a peak. And while we don't know the exact threshold value between peak and feeder, we don't need to, because there are no data points between the range of 7 and 12.7 seconds. With this distinction made, we know that both 14.3 and 14.4 are peaks, which is why Zone 3, consisting of blocks 5 and 6, did not have stacking. Zone 4 has a similar duration of around 28 seconds, but the blocks are split less evenly, with only one peak. This is why stacking occurs here. 2 peaks here implies that this section is perfectly fine up until we get closer to the 14-second intervals. However, our next 2 zones are both made up of only 1 peak each, and that's a problem, because now we're just looking at raw ride time. We cannot reduce their time without removing the delays. And the delays are important because those are going to be show scenes for the ride, and we're going to have audio playing and lots of exposition explaining the story of the ride. It becomes a prioritization. Are we going to prioritize the storytelling and the atmosphere of the ride, or are we going to prioritize maximum capacity here? I think a lot of you would agree that the storytelling takes precedence here, because this is a game after all. So to conclude, our final theoretical capacity will be 1,778 riders per hour with our generous delays, not quite reaching our goal of 2,000 riders per hour. It should be noted, however, that the audio for these show scenes is not yet finalized, and I accounted for more delay than I probably needed to, so there exists the possibility to decrease these delays, thus increasing capacity, but we'll just have to see. So with that, we've solved the coaster. I'm tired of math. Let's close this video out. As an added bonus, just for fun, I made the ideal coaster scenario. This involves no changes to the layout and all delays removed. With these changes, we managed to get minimum dispatches of around 22.7 seconds, which you can see one interval on the screen. This is directly on par with our chart, with the bottleneck again being caused by the blocks 7 and 8, but this time their occupancies are 7 seconds and 15.8 seconds. 22.7 second intervals equates to 158 dispatches per hour or 2,212 riders per hour, completely smashing our goal of 2,000 riders per hour, and all we had to do was remove the delays. And if we want to completely optimize the coaster, another major inefficiency is the motorbike and sidecar train itself. These trains are roughly 16 meters long, yet they only fit 14 riders each. If we really wanted to move people through, we could replace these trains with more efficient ones, say the 24-passenger Intamin LSM trains like the ones on Velocicoaster. We'd then get an insane 3,792 riders per hour. Now there also exists the 4-across Intamin Hyper trains, like those seen on Hyperion. An equivalently long 16-meter train would fit 32 riders per train, yielding us our fully optimized, outrageous theoretical capacity of 5,056 riders per hour. We nearly tripled Hagrid's capacity, and all we had to do was lower the quality of the theming and remove the unique trains that make Hagrid's. So I'm going to leave you all with a POV, since the ride will look vastly different by the time I show it off next. Don't roast it too hard, guys. It's just a family coaster. And there's no theming. Like, could you imagine Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure without Hagrid? Or the magical creatures? It's just motorbike adventure. I mean, currently that's what this ride is. So, you know what? Go ahead and roast it. It's your life. Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this very different episode. I don't think I've seen anyone focus on the logistical side of coaster design in this game, so thought I'd take a stab at it. As always, let me know what you think in the comments below. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. So take care. Bye-bye.